All right, listeners, it's Ryan and Megan, and welcome to the Mental Health Mixtape, a podcast dedicated to fostering open conversations, sharing stories, and exploring a diverse range of topics related to mental health. So hold on to your seats as we sit down with some amazing guests to get their perspectives on the ever-changing landscape of mental health. And for all you old folks, no need to hit the record and pause button. Just sit back and let us navigate life's playlist together. During this podcast, you may hear stories about traumatic events and our guests' experiences. There may be discussions about suicide, traumatic events, and the outcomes from these events on personal lives. If you're struggling with anything you hear, please reach out to your peer support team, psychologist, call 911, or head to the nearest hospital. In Canada, you could call Boots on the Ground peer support for first responders at 1-833-677-2668. Talk Suicide Canada at 1-833-456-4566. And in the United States, call 988 for the National Crisis and Suicide Lifeline. It should be noted that the information shared on this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional medical, psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All right, listeners, it's Megan and Ryan, and welcome to the Mental Health Mixtape, a podcast dedicated to fostering open conversations, sharing stories, and exploring a diverse range of topics related to mental health. Before we get started, I incorrectly introduced our next guest as James Rychard, when in fact it's James Rychard. So for that, James, I do apologize. And on another show note, during our conversation, James makes reference to needing an undergraduate degree to get into Annapolis, the United States Naval Academy. The United States Naval Academy is an undergraduate college of the United States Naval Service, located in Annapolis, Maryland. It prepares young men and women to become professional officers of competence, character, and compassion in the United States Navy and Marine Corps. They attend the academy for 4 years, graduating with a Bachelor's of Science degree, and commissions as ensigns in the Navy or second lieutenants in the Marine Corps. So hold on to your seats as we sit down with James and have a great conversation about the ever-changing landscape of mental health, from leadership all the way through to his service as a firefighter. So you just got back, Megan. You're a little bit of a world traveler today.
Yes, I got back last night from Nashville from Vision 2020 Community Risk Reduction Symposium 8, which is a mouthful. My goodness. But it was great. Talking all things fire and community risk reduction, which was exciting. So this is a timely chat because we have kind of an expert, I would say, in the field who's joined us today. Hey, Jamie.
Hi, Megan. How are you?
Good. Okay, you two have met before or no?
No, this was our first time. So when we hopped on, it was a quick introduction and kind of just started off with kind of the format of what we're going to do today. So, for our listeners, James Rychard is, I'll let him introduce himself. He's probably better at it over the span of this stuff, but we have the distinct pleasure of having him on our podcast today. So I am so grateful that you took the time out and grateful for the conversation we're about to have. So why don't we just start there, Jamie? I mean, give us an idea of what you've done, because really we only ask one question when we talk to our guests, and it's how did you get to where you are today, sitting here with us on a podcast? And we've had so many different places that people have started from, but wherever you feel comfortable, just share how you got to where you are today.
Okay, well, I actually originally wanted to be a teacher, a kindergarten teacher. So I had focused my studies on psychology through university. I was a varsity football athlete as well. So I really was enjoying the physical aspect as well as the psychology. And unfortunately, I didn't really make it into teachers college. So I needed to kind of redirect. So I took a skills and interest test to find out what else I could do. And firefighting came up as one of them. So luckily for me, where I was working and living, fire station just down the street, decided to go in, have a conversation with them, fell in love with the trucks, fell in love with the equipment. As a third generation truck driver, it just fit me just perfectly. And then I just realized that there was a physical component to firefighting, but there was also that teacher aspect. There was that ability to teach fire safety, and I knew I kind of found my home. So after 3.5 years of pursuing fire, I finally got in. I got in with the city of Cambridge, and it was probably about 3 years after I got in, I decided to begin to focus on organizational behavior. The fire chief there, Fire Chief Terry Allen, actually had organizational behavior textbook inside each station. And it was there that I actually uncovered workplace stress. And I was completely enamored with the topic because it was going back to my post-secondary studies in psychology. And I thought, wow, here's a great opportunity to merge psychology with workplace, with the fire service. And Chief Allen and I coordinated Ontario's first wellness symposium. It was in May of 2006. And we invited 14 different departments to come and join us there. And it was fantastic. So that's where mental health kind of started for me. And it was really interesting. So I'm sitting before you today because when I became a firefighter at the city of Burlington, which was about 4.5 years after I got on with Cambridge, I began to focus on leadership development, specifically trying to see how we can get leadership and mental health merged together. And yeah, so I began to focus on getting onto some committees. I got on with some committees with the IAFC, with the CAFC. I even belonged to the Fire Service Psychology Association as well. And mental health is just such a passionate place for me, just because I believe psychology and the fire service, there's such a big gap and we need to kind of narrow it. So in that whole roundabout story, it just feels really great to start off from wanting to be a teacher to getting onto the fire service to getting into becoming a little bit of a passionate soul with the fire service psychology side.
Well, and you know what, Jamie, I will say, so you and I might need you to help me jog my memory on how you and I met, because it feels like I've known you. It feels like I've known you forever in a really natural way, because I think we have so much alignment in how we think about things and talk about things. But I will say about you, you still are a teacher. Like, you are someone, like, hardly, like, certainly a week doesn't go by with you not getting in touch with me going, what do you think about this? Or what about this idea? Or I've written this, take a look at it. And I just admire that about you. I know I've maybe said that to you before. I want to say it again. Like, I admire how thoughtful you are. You know, you're not someone who just sort of sits and just observes what happens. You are really invested and really engaged and really curious about why things are the way they are and can they be better. And I mean, I think that's a leadership component that you bring to the work that you do, but you also you are absolutely a teacher. And yeah, I really respect that about you.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you.
So let's talk leadership. I mean, this is something that you and I talk about lots. Well, no, I mean, you know, you talk and think about stress and human performance, and how do we think about bringing new paradigms and new frameworks to the fire service? Where did the love or the interest of that come from?
Well, I think the biggest thing for me when it comes to leadership is Simon Sinek. And I just love how he talks about, you know, protecting the person to the left of you and protecting the person to the right of you. That person, you know, anthropologically is a leader. And I love how he uses biology and anthropology, excuse me. I love his lens and how he applies that to business, because he's basically saying, if we just work with what we know, if we work with the biology, we work with the anthropology, then we don't have to, you know, go against the stream kind of thing. We're actually going more with the flow. And I love what he does with it, because he goes in, he talks about different teams. He talks about why those different teams were so effective, and the leadership, how leading is all about leading the people, not leading the results. And I love that. And I think that really became my focus as well, because I started to really understand and really grip what it really meant to be a leader. And it really started to resonate with me. And Simon Sinek is probably one of my favorite people to watch. There's this one called Leaders. It's Simon Sinek in the 99U. It's on YouTube, and it's fantastic. Leaders Eat Last, and it's, wow, just riveting. He talks about, you know, serotonin, dopamine, cortisol, epinephrine. Like, he talks about, endorphins. He talks about so many of our neurochemicals, and they make sense because it's all about biology. So rather than just fight what is really inexistent, if we absorb it, understand it, appreciate it, and work with it, I think there'd be so much more cohesiveness inside our teams, inside our organizations.
I like that. Because I think, for me anyway, when we talk about mental health, it is about the underpinnings of the neurobiology. We can't override it. We can train to use it, right? We talk about that in the functional disconnection piece, right? When we need to, we can suppress certain parts of that emotional state, but the neurobiology, the biology doesn't shift. We're still reacting to a stressor. And our leaders across the nation. I mean, we had a guest on a few weeks ago, we just posted last week, Heather Edwards, who talked about the difference between management and leadership. And I think really people need to understand the difference between those two, because I think that's the most important piece. You can have an amazing leader that leads teams really effectively and puts the people first and empowers them, or you can have a manager, and that doesn't necessarily that doesn't necessarily translate to a positive team environment. Managers, and I'm going to paraphrase what Heather said. I think managers are in charge of budgets and operations and the tactical things in the back end. Leaders lead from the floor, really. And it doesn't need to be a chief or a deputy chief. It can be a senior firefighter, or it can be a recruit leading in certain situations. And that neurobiological piece is so fundamental to understand what is actually going on and how we can work with it. So what are your thoughts around that leadership management kind of definition in your experience based upon what you've said so far?
Well, based upon my experience, I think it's exactly what Heather was actually talking about. If leaders would choose to relinquish more control, they would probably alleviate half of the stress they actually deal with at work. Because if we engage and we empower people below who are really more on the front lines, or more in touch, or more in tune with what's going on with the results, it's basically help. It's not only engaging and empowering them, but it's giving the leaders the opportunity to focus on other things, like where the vision is going for the organization, making sure the mission is being adhered to, what resources need to be in place in order for the subordinates, if you will, to get closer towards those results. So I think it's interesting, because it seems like, especially in the fire service, it seems like the leaders feel that they need to be responsible for the results, because they have to report to council, they have to report to the city managers and the chief administrative officers. But there's only so much time, and we have so many wonderful, smart, engaged, empowered firefighters that could make significant contributions to the organizations, that could help them with the results if they chose to relinquish a little bit of control, give them more empowerment, give them more opportunities. It's funny, I guess I'm going to kind of jump into the article that I kind of wrote. And, there's this gentleman by Mr. Kazuo Inamori, who was the former CEO and chairman of Japan Airlines. And he was a former Buddhist monk turned CEO. And the greatest thing about Mr. Kazuo Inamori is that he brought, philosophy and psychology to the aerospace industry, to Japan Airlines. And he turned it around from going from a bankruptcy situation to incredibly, incredibly profitable. And he did it through this concept called amoeba management, where he gave more decision-making power to individuals and employees who are down below, with leaders of those amoebas, little teams, with incredible decision-making power. Now, they didn't have the ability to put everything into place. They had to obviously seek permission from the executives in order to say yes, yay, or nay. But they did the work. And the greatest thing about them doing the work is that they become engaged. They become more enthused. There's more of an esprit de corps going on. And I think, if the fire service chose to do something like that and mirrored some of these private sector practices, something like what's come from Mr. Kazuo Inamori and Japan Airlines, I really feel excited about the potential that what could actually occur if there was an organization that chose to kind of mirror those type of engagement, empowerment practices.
So let me ask you this, because I mean, I read your article, I read lots of things. I love Simon Sinek as well. And it all seems so commonsensical, I guess. So I can't help myself but wondering, I hear you talk and I'm like, yeah, track, I'm with you. So why doesn't this happen? Like, what's your perspective? What's going on? I mean, obviously we're talking about the fire service specifically, but what's your perspective or your opinion on why doesn't this happen then?
I think the only reason why I think it's not happening is because there's this sense of urgency. When these voids occur, when a fire chief or a deputy fire chief leaves an organization, there is a sense of urgency to get that filled. And I'm not sure if we're filling the voids exactly the way we could be filling the voids. Are we finding the right candidates to fit the seats? Or are we just finding the candidates who can do the position? So if we had, so you take a look at private sector organizations, and if an executive, an executive comes in, a corporate executive comes in, and they're causing some issues or causing some rifts, they are now put together with a coach, an executive coach, who is now championing that person for 6 months to 12 months, working alongside them to help them become more proficient, more effective in their role as CEO. Why can't we do that in the fire service? Why can't we put individuals in that have this great character, have this great potential, yet they're only missing maybe a couple competencies, and then we could put them with an executive coach? Why can't we? And then we can get them to work alongside, and it's kind of like taking the training wheels off, and then all of a sudden they're just on their own, but they're hitting the ground running, and that would result in less grievances and less arbitrations and increased morale. And wouldn't that be a great way of fiscal responsibility for that position within the organization? So to answer your question, I think it really has a lot to do with the fact that there's a time sense of urgency to get the positions filled, and we don't have time to look for individuals who just have the character, might not have the competencies, and therefore, in doing that, we might be sacrificing by focusing more on the competencies, we might be sacrificing more of the character.
Would you say that? Yeah, sorry, this burning question, but would you say that some of the roadblocks, I guess, to leadership development is the promotion from within an organization, and how that ties to mental health and stigma around years ago? Because, I can look back at some of the people that I've worked with in leadership positions that were promoted from the street and moved up, and then wrap that in with the stigma from 15 years ago, and now they're in leadership positions. Do you see that as a barrier as well?
I think my thought is on promotion within. If the fire service chooses to just go traditional and just go by what they've always done, that organization will continue to just put individuals into positions of power and influence from within. Those that study private sector practices, those that seek what's going on and the best practices that go on in other successful fire services, are willing to take these chances, willing to take these experiments, willing to work with, the executives and the unions to say, hey, we're going to try something different. Maybe we need a letter of understanding here, but we're going to try something different. And the other thing, I don't necessarily know if there's enough succession planning going on within the organizations. Are we tapping the right individuals who demonstrate that they have potential for leadership? I mean, we're talking about the U.S. Navy, and we talk about Annapolis. You just need to have a university degree, and then you can get in to become an officer. Doesn't mean you're going to become an officer, but they will train you to become an officer. And then all of a sudden, you're in charge of some significant departments on a ship. Why can't we do the same thing in the fire service? Why is it always just within? Why can't we create our own Annapolis, where we actually create a very universal professional development system that incorporates character, that incorporates competencies, that incorporates, commitment? I'm using that as a phrase because the Ivy School of Business has created this this formula, if you will, for effective leadership, and it's commitment plus competencies plus character equals effective leadership. And it stemmed from the financial crisis that came from 2008. and they uncovered that it was character that was missing. This program has been so successful after their research over a decade. The Canada Revenue Agency uses it. The Canadian Border Services Agency uses it. The RCMP uses it. The Canadian military uses it. Why can't the fire service use it? And if we did, would we not increase the propensity to put the right people in the right positions because we're getting the character in there? We're developing their competencies. So more of the development would happen within if we had the right framework put in place.
So, I mean, you sit at a lot of tables, you know, you're on a lot of committees, you're part of the CAFC, Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, etc. Like, you're really involved. So, like, what's the appetite for this when you're out there? Because again, like, I'm just sitting here going like, yep. Let's do it. So what do you find when you try to share these ideas in a broader kind of way?
You know, there's a famous saying by the former fire chief, Alan Brunacini from the Phoenix Fire Department. He's pretty much the godfather when it comes to the fire service leadership. Everyone is trying to become or mirror or extrapolate some of his practices because he's so well regarded. And he had a saying. He said, firefighters hate two things: the way things are and change. Right. And I think because fire service leaders were at one time firefighters, I think that is the mentality and the modality that kind of permeates through the profession. And so as we go through our careers and we kind of resist a little bit of change, but then we get, disappointed with just the way things are, I think that kind of creeps up. So you're talking about a very highly renowned institution such as the Ivy Business School to adopt something that's been, brought into and used in another sector. That's a little risky for the fire service.
Yeah, I mean, the 100 years of tradition unimpeded by progress, right? I mean, like that's a big thing, right? And trying to, I mean, people, I was saying this last week or the week before, like, from what I've observed at least, and I think we have lots of evidence to back this up, one of the first things you can expect when you try to change something is resistance, right? Like, we don't like to change. We want to stay in our baseline, even if our baseline isn't great, or even if it's hurting us, right? We're more inclined to stay with things that are familiar because change is so difficult. And yet, right, I hear this call and this wish all the time in all the different places I go for things to be different, right? For us to be able to evolve, and particularly in the fire service, right? Like, I hear these calls for really innovative action all the time. So I inevitably just end up wondering, I wonder what it's going to take. Like, is that an IAFF thing? Is that an individual fire service thing? Is that the CAFC? Like, who has to be the ambassador for that?
I just think we need one department to kind of champion it and then just do a baseline and then just follow it and just go, yeah, this is the way we're going to go.
So Jamie, what does character look like to you? What does that mean?
When I think of character, it's, competencies is what you are on the job. Character is who you are on the job, who you are as a person, who do you decide to show up. Your integrity, your humanity, your temperance, your ability to be accountable, like all those sorts of things. And when we talk about leaders who have character, they don't want to take all the accolades for the results. They want to give it to the team. But when it comes to the accountability piece, because they're the ones that are in charge, they're the ones that take the responsibility. That's character. That's huge. And I think if we model it at the leadership level, it's the subordinates that see it and go, that's what I want to be. That's who I want to emulate. That's who I want to become. Because when you're a person of character, you're not really acting in a period or a position of stress.
I find myself just curious about, like, where did this come from for you? So like, who was that person for you? Who did you look around and go, I want to be like that. I want to be that person. Or like, who inspires you? I mean, apart from Simon Sinek or whomever, who's been like in your personal life or in your career that's really been that North Star where you're like, that's where I want to head?
You know, I was so fortunate to get on with the Cambridge Fire Department back in 2002, which is 22 years ago. It's a long time. Yeah. And my fire chief, Terry Allen, he had a degree in religion. He had his master's in public administration. He was recognized 3 times as being the fire chief of the year. And when it came to Chief Allen, who had the department set up in committees, he created a relationship by objectives way of negotiating, which basically mirrored what was going on with Phoenix. There was amicable relations. There was never really a lot. I can't recall any grievances that were really outstanding that turned into arbitrations or anything like that. He created an environment where if there's money in the budget and this is what the crews want, let's do it. Not why do I have to give it to you? It's like, yeah, that's what you want. Let's do it. It's not really going to be, I'm not using this budget like it's my own money. I'm basically saying I'm the one that's in control of the budget. But if this is what you crews are looking for, why can't we try it? But there's one situation that happened with Chief Allen that really made me think about why he's the epitome to me as a character. We were washing the trucks at the end of the shift, and this was back when we were doing our 4 10-hour days. And as a normal practice, we would always make sure that the chief's cars were all fueled up, would be washed first before the apparatus were washed. And the chief had to have been out. We just got back from the station. We washed the trucks because his car was not there. And as we were washing, the chief pulled in and started pumping his own gas. We ran over to him and said, Chief, we're sorry. He says, no, that's okay. I got it. What I love about him is that leadership doesn't come with just the status and the power. That's his ability to help create influence. He doesn't expect us to do all that stuff. And when we were in a position, he didn't just, drop the keys and expected us to do it. He just went and did it. And I love that. And I think as a leader, when you're able to demonstrate that you have that sense of humanity, you garner respect and you garner a lot of regard.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I think that's like, if someone's going to, convey a sense of respect to me or indicate that in some way they want to model their behavior after how I live my life or how I work or whatever, I want it to be because of what they've seen, not because they've been told to be that way, right? Or that they should or something like that,
Simon Sinek is the one that actually says, you can be a leader. You can be in charge, but you're more of an authoritarian. You're not a leader. You're telling people what to do and we'll follow you because you're telling us what to do, but you're not necessarily a leader. And I guess that's an interesting point. It's that, what are we aspiring? If we're moving up in the fire service, what are we aspiring for? Are we aspiring to be that authoritarian? Or are we aspiring to be that influencer? Creating that engagement, creating that empowerment, helping people become better people so they become better firefighters, but also so they become better spouses, partners, fathers, and mothers. Because in my opinion, I think that the happier a person is at work, there's more propensity for them to be a happier person at home. And if they're happier at home, they become happier at work. It becomes cyclical.
No, I mean, I totally. I mean, what I'm sort of reflecting on as we're talking here too is then like, because I completely agree with you, and I'll take a broader perspective and go, if someone feels like they're more valued and respected and recognized within their work environment, and then they take that feeling or that experience and it somehow is integrated into their home life, into how they are in relationships, how they parent, like inevitably, I think that does a lot by way of healing our communities, right? And our communities right now feel pretty, there's a lot of anger out there. They feel lots of times very divided. You know, there's lots of sort of social issues that we're having to contend with. And, you know, there's a part for me where I think all of these things maybe impact people just generally being happier, more fulfilled, or more willing to be kind, or whatever, right? And if work can play a role in that, it should, you know. So I'm thinking of that, and then I'm thinking, how does this all interplay with operational stress? How does this all interplay with post-traumatic stress injuries, right? Because I very much believe that when people are not well, when they're maybe struggling with a stress-related injury, they tend to become more rigid. They tend to have more, you know, dogmatic sort of shoulds about how life and themselves and other people are supposed to be. So what's your perspective on that, Jamie? Like, how do you see, you know, obviously this is the mental health mixtape. How do you see mental health playing into some of the things that are or are not happening with leadership in the fire service?
You know, I wrote an article for Canadian Firefighter, and I called it the sandwich effect. So it's it's an idea, or it could be a theory. But I believe that if you have firefighters that come into work and there's so much organizational stress going on, and then they go home and there's so much personal stress going on, it sandwiches those firefighters into the operational stress where normally, and I'm going to use a metaphor, if the water falls off the duck's back normally, maybe this time it kind of sticks a little bit more. And I'm wondering if those could be those post-traumatic stress injuries that are going on, these little micro injuries that over time just kind of seem to add up. But I'm not convinced that it's actually just emergency response. I have a feeling, and a lot of feeling, that has to do with the non-emergency, which means leadership as well as home life. And so if leaders chose to do what they can to strengthen the organization, make it a psychologically safer organization, make it more engaged, make it more empowered, creating that amoeba management philosophy. And then we give people resources and tools and techniques on how they can become better people. And they take those lessons and they bring it to their home front and they become better there. Now you're talking about firefighters with a little bit more ability, a little bit more emotional resiliency to take on the unpredictability of the operational stress.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting you bring it up that way, because I think from my experience working in mental health supports and peer support and all the things that I've done in the past, it's not so much the calls, right? It's going to work and knowing what you're about to walk into, feeling undervalued, overworked, asking to do more with less. That tends to be the common narrative that I've heard over the last 5-6 years. And that's the stressors that people are taking home, including myself before I retired, right? And I think those little, as you put them, those micro pieces is just, it's like water over a stone. Eventually, over thousands of years, it's going to wear that stone down. If you want to use that metaphor, it's the constant asking to do more. It's the little erosion of that validation piece of, hey, you're doing a great job. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing, or the lack of, that really kind of layers into the potential for people to feel frustrated and go home. But I like that cyclical kind of thing when we support the individual, whether it's at home or at work with tools or training. You know, we start to build that kind of that feedback loop where things maybe start to improve at home, which shifts and changes how we show up for work. And then how we show up for work impacts how we show up at home. And this nice little cycle kind of starts to build. At least that's from my experience, what I've experienced over the last number of years. And I guess, you know, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, when we look at the whole concepts of human performance, really, we're talking about the neurobiology, we're talking about biology, we're talking about, you know, all of those pieces that help support the individual system. Then we have to add in the organizational system that you've so nicely talked about, and how we can support people when they show up at work. You know, how do we do that? You know, is it just training? We all like training. I mean, let's be honest, if you're a firefighter or a paramedic or a police officer, we want more training. I can't tell you how many times we've heard that, right? So how do we train in that space? I know for me, it's mindfulness and meditation. I know it's, doing those things that support the individual, but I had to learn that on my own. So what is your thoughts around all of that, kind of messy kind of space? Because it is kind of really, we're not trained in it. We don't train in it.
Well, to answer that, I think the way we're looking at the fire service, if we looked at it or chose to look at it through an athletic lens, I think this all would make a little bit more sense. And the reason why I say that is this. When you take a look at the fire service, when you took a look at what firefighters do on the fire ground, there is an element of sport to the job. Yep. And because of that, I actually feel and real firmly believe that if we had sports psychologists or even mental performance coaches inside our organizations, working alongside training officers, we're talking about individuals who can help with distractions, help with people when they're dealing with failure. We could help people get back in the game in addition to learning the techniques and tools and tricks that training officers teach for fireground and rescue techniques. Morphing those together, now you get a professional development system. And in addition to that, you're actually embedding a psychologist within the fire service. And the cool thing about a mental performance coach, so I wrote another article for, I think it got published in Firefighting in Canada. And Canadian Firefighter. And it was on mental performance coaching. And I used Jean-François Menard, who is the Canadian Olympic coach, who actually says you need to train your brain like an Olympian. And his techniques, his ideas, his thoughts, his insights have everything to do with just the ordinary individual who works in any type of industry. That just if you start training your brain to think more like how athletes think and train their brains, we can actually become better, more proficient, healthier, dealing with less stress, have more peak performances, and then you talk about administration, like fire administration. Now we take a look at maybe the Harvard Business Review's article that they wrote called The Making of a Corporate Athlete. And Dr. Jim Lear, who's a performance psychologist, plus Tony Schwartz, wrote this great paper that focuses on how to get your ideal performance state. And you need to focus on your physical, your mental, your emotional, and your spiritual capacities. And by putting good rituals and practices in place, you create that ideal performance state. Well, the really cool thing about what they did in their research through the Harvard Business Review is you're taking a look at C-suite level executives who were dealing with an exuberant amount of stress, not really being very productive in their jobs. And by instituting athletic concepts, they were able to become not only more proficient, but they were better people at home as well. And so why can't that transition into the fire service? And in order to do that, we really need to take a look at the fire service through an athletic lens. We need to bring in a mental performance coach. And we need to get firefighters to start training their brain like Olympians.
I mean, so I think Jamie, and certainly Ryan and I talk about this. I mean, in developing the before operational stress program, I mean, that's a huge perspective that I believe in and I attempt to bring to my work, which is, trying to help people recognize that, let me put it this way, when, horribly, violent or difficult or traumatic things happen, or there's, fires or motor vehicle accidents, whatever it is, right? I mean, it's not about dismissing or denying or minimizing that those things are serious and impactful and what have you. But it's really trying to shift this perspective on, we are going to maybe experience these things and obviously at much higher rates in the fire service. And, if you actually can develop skills and perspectives and habits and trainings and all the different kinds of things, so that you can, integrate these experiences and maybe even be able to further your own development in relation to how you experience them or go through them, or right this. So it's really trying to challenge this idea of people not having any control or agency in their life. To me, that's one of the things that we really need to do more of, is like, the things that happen are not necessarily your responsibility. They may have been things that were very, very unpredictable and unfair and unjust and whatever. And I'm not going to argue or debate that with you. And yet, the only thing any of us can do is find a way to take responsibility for then how we're going to be with that thing, or how we're going to move through that thing.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes from Andrew Huberman, and I'm just looking it up right now. It says, "The reason to deliberately do hard things is so that self-elected challenges arrive, and they will. You can tell yourself, I don't know how this is all going to turn out, but I'm certain I can do hard things. Don't self-injure. But doing hard things is always worthwhile." Right?
Yeah.
Right? Why do we do the training we do? It's hard. It's difficult. Fire service training. I'm part of Canada Task Force 2, and, seeing some of the recruits on the floor doing all their fireground survival training and all the other training that, police officers do from hand-to-hand combat, and then when we look at that from a personal performance piece, why do we go out for ruck marches, Megan? Because they're hard and they suck sometimes. But, now if I go out for a 30-kilometer walk or a 15-kilometer walk, well, my metric was 48.9 kilometers that we did. If I can do 48.9, 30 is easy, right? So I think just doing hard things is always worth it, whether that's training. And then I think that'll help shift the whole idea that, it's that victim mentality. Things happen to me. And what did you call it, Megan? I
Agency?
can't. Yeah, well, no, there was something else that you used a term, a couple conversations we've had, but it's that idea that, we have more control over how we show up and what we do and how we perceive hardship, right? And we can choose to lean into that space and accept it as an opportunity for growth and learning, or become a victim to it if we choose that path, right?
Yeah.
Just do hard things.
Yeah, and I think I think this ties into leadership, and I don't know. I mean, this is just something that I think about, and I don't know if this is the way that I should think about it or not. But something that's important for me in whatever leadership role I maybe occupy is, I don't want to ask anyone to do something that I'm not prepared to do myself, right? And so if there's a measure of discomfort that something might bring, I want to be willing and able to tolerate that discomfort before I would expect or ever expect anyone else to be willing to engage in that.
When we talk about mental performance coaching, you're talking about trying things that are harder. I mean, the one good thing about mental performance coaches is that they teach, or they work with athletes, which would be firefighters, on how do you gain your individualized zone of optimal performance. So the big window is right, how do we create that sense of flow? How do we get that 4 to 5% challenge for your level of skill set? Maybe the reason why a lot of firefighters are maybe having some challenges, that the current challenges that they're doing are exceeding that 4 to 5%, right? So if it's too low, they're not really engaged because they're bored. But if it's too high, then they're anxious and frustrated. So, these are the important concepts that these mental performance coaches bring to the fire service that maybe training officers don't know. And I think by merging those two worlds together, we could increase the confidence in firefighters. We can increase the emotional resiliency in firefighters. We can get them to really take care of themselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually a lot better, so they can be better prepared to handle the difficult challenges that they face that are unpredictable. And then there's no reason why mental performance coaches couldn't be used for fire service leaders as well.
I was just about to ask that question. There's the executive leadership coaches, there's the Harvard courses, people like courses, and they'll take a certificate or whatever, but it needs to be, and from what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it needs to be more one-on-one, where you're paired with that coach and you go through the motions and you learn and you build competencies towards that. Is that kind of where you're leaning with that?
100%. I mean, you take a look at a fire service leader, and fire service leaders are fallible. They'll make mistakes, but what if they have too much pressure going on? I mean, this could go into that human factors, human performance piece. Human factors talks about what are the 5 to 7 precursors that affect people's decisions and their judgments. I mean, we're talking about sleep, executive pressure, unfamiliarity, incompetence. Like, there are so many different factors that can affect someone's decision. Well, if someone created a report and there was so much pressure put on them and they'd made a mistake, well, now they're dealing with that mistake. And what if they're having a hard time dealing with it? What if they're really in a challenging mode? Well, this is where these mental performance coaches can come in and help them and work with them and give some psychological tools and techniques and insights of what they can do to bounce back.
Because you see, I think what I observe at least is that there's too much of a relationship to that, where there's all these things going on, whatever, where, and I'll say this is specifically for leaders, it's like, I don't have time, it's not my time. Really, I've got to just kind of put my head down and keep going, right? And I understand that as being really a reflection of someone's integrity, where they're like, I've got people to look after, I've got things to do, like I don't want people to see me, showing any wear and tear, whatever the case may be. And I think they miss the fact that the engagement in the recognition, the vulnerability to express, here's what's happening, and pairing that with, I'm going to work with somebody, I'm going to build a wise counsel, I'm going to read, I'm going to engage in different ways of understanding. I think people miss the fact that that is really powerful, and that is leadership from my perspective, at least. Like, that's really where people inspire other people, is being able to go, I'm not just going to put my head down and keep going, because that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm actually going to try to bring in people or work with this in such a way as to develop, something in myself. And then that's going to help me be more available to other people. And I guess that's the part, right? And I don't know if that's still, the tradition, the stigma, the history, whatever it is, I still see that as a hard thing for a lot of people to do, and certainly a hard thing for a lot of leaders to do.
If we take a look at leadership and we think of it like a ship, like floating inside, like sailing in the ocean. If they want to do a course direction, it's not just going to turn, it's going to be small course directions in order to get the 180 turn.
Right.
The fire service is the same. We just have to do small incremental progressions in order to get us in that direction. And I mean, what we're talking about little 1% changes. I mean, we're talking about the Kaizen, going back to Kazu Inamori and using Japanese principles, continuous daily improvement, Kaizen. If we use those 1% incremental changes and put those daily progressions in, leadership organizations will become more effective, more efficient, more engaged, more empowered. And then again, that equates to happier employees. And I think, in my opinion, I think that's the ultimate return on investment. When you have happier employees who are more engaged and more empowered, and leaders who don't have to do as much leading because they're providing the tools, the resources, and the guidance for the subordinates to do the work, everyone wins. My fear is that there's so much control at the top that it's creating so much stress. This is where these human factors come in, right? And that's why human factors and human performance is a huge piece, I think, for the fire service, because we really do need to keep ourselves in shape like an athlete, because there's so many executive pressures. There's so many internal and external pressures to deal with. That's why we have to relinquish a little bit of control. That's why we need a little bit more of that amoeba management philosophy, where we give more responsibility of helping to bring more of this information in the decision making to lower subordinates within the organization to help us.
I mean, so I can't remember who said it, and I'm going to screw up the full quote, but like this idea that excellence then is really about a series of daily habits versus, some big thing that you do in order to cultivate or achieve that. So, Jamie, from your perspective then, if we boil this down to anybody who might be listening to this, and like what's actually tangible and actionable for the individual firefighter, like what do you recommend?
Well, I think the best thing that Simon Sinek says is just be the leader that you want to be. M- My thing for firefighters is just find something that you really enjoy. Like firefighting is a fantastic job. We have a lot of downtime.
Mm-hmm.
Educate yourself, find some passions that you really enjoy. Do what you can to get your peak performance in, so you create that sense of flow where your innovation, your creativity is coming through. And don't be afraid to provide better ways of doing business. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with those suggestions, because we're trying to bring more psychological safety into the fire service, into organizations where, you know, in non-emergency times, we could actually um, kind of appreciate those dissenting views. You know, have you thought about this, or can we try this? Or firefighters are on the ground, they see everything looking up. They're really, really in tune. And I think we're not, you know, as leaders, it would be fantastic to kind of tap into that, tap into those firefighters, and, you know, what do you see? What's going well? What's not going well? And what do we need to change? And getting firefighters' voices in there not only engages them and empowers them, but it really has a way of just making the organization just better. And then so firefighters, I would say, don't be afraid to say things, voice your opinion.
And so what I hear in that is, it sounds like a nuance would be like, don't be afraid to use your voice or share your opinion, like to your leader, or in a productive way where perhaps you're making a recommendation for something you see or believe could make a difference, versus some of the in discussions that can happen, right? Because I don't at all hear you saying, you know, let's all get together and complain about what's not working. What I hear you saying is, you know, be creative, educate yourself, and then don't be afraid to bring things into your organization to say, what if we tried this instead, right? Because I don't think it's about finding people who think the way that you do and who share the complaints you have. I think it's about trying to, um, you know, facilitate progress.
100%. I made a recent LinkedIn post, and my post is talking about photo albums. And it was something that I loved to do with my grandma. I used to sit down with her, loved going through the pictures. And it reminded me, so when we had a fire chief that came to the city of Burlington, and he wanted to get to know people fast. He wanted to know his staff fast. So he had the secretary build a photo album of all our photos with our names. And within a very short period of time, he knew us by name. And I thought to myself, that is such a brilliant concept, because he's putting the work in to get to know the staff, to build that rapport, to build that morale, to build that personal personification, if you will. What if we did that with resumes? What if we used the same concept, but we extrapolated and from the resumes, different people's skill sets? We have firefighters that come from all walks of life that bring in such different skill sets, and we're relying on consultants to come in and help us solve problems. Why can't we go from within? Why can't we use that same concept and extrapolate skill sets that firefighters are coming to the table with to help fire service leaders solve their problems in their organizations?
I love that. You know, when I first started with the city of Calgary, Chief Tom Sampson, he did something similar. You know, every recruit class had a picture, your name, and a couple things about you. And, you know, I remember when Chief Sampson approached me in one of our hospitals, he just happened to be out checking on the crews. That was one of his things. He was very personable. He was very upfront. And he addressed me by my first name, and I just didn't like, I'm a new guy, but that was part of his practice, the picture album, right? I think I want to just loop back on one thing that I find very important that maybe our listeners might benefit from is you mentioned the 4 states. So it was spiritual, physical, emotional, and psychological pieces of training. And I think we're really good at training people in the physical spaces, right? how do we get people into the other three realms? Now, spiritual, it isn't necessarily organized religion. It could be just a sense of higher purpose. But I think that's an important piece for some of the listeners to really understand. And I'll speak from my experience. Until I really understood the other four domains, three domains other than the physical, I really was kind of not stuck, but kind of spinning my wheels in my own personal development. And it was only until, through meditation and mindfulness practice, my mentor, understanding emotional intelligence, reading a lot of books, that's something that can be done potentially as well. What are your thoughts around just the training space of those four domains? Because I think that's such a fascinating kind of place to get to as a peak performance and, human factors and human performance piece.
Well, I'll tell you, Ryan, I think you hit the nail right on the head with the emotional intelligence. It would be fantastic if emotional intelligence was actually incorporated into recruit class trainings. Because understanding the emotions of ourselves and understanding the emotions of others and our relationship management and our social management of those is just key. Yeah. I mean, we talk about the fire service, we talk about our crews, they're like little families. And we're going to have disputes, we're going to get along, we're not going to get along. Having that emotional intelligence on how we can deal with problems is just key. So, like you said, just educating yourself on emotional intelligence, and then the mental piece is just, to be quite firm, is just go out, go for walks, get out in nature, get your mind away from the job. But when you're commuting in nature, there's this therapeutic sense of just, it's touching on all your senses. It's not touching on your taste, obviously, but definitely your hearing, the sights, the sounds, and it has a complete way of just regrouping who you are as a person, who you are as an individual, and it gives you that sense of clarity. It brings you back to when you were just kind of vulnerable and younger and just free and vibrant as a child, and everything just seems to come a little bit more clear. So, and the spirituality piece doesn't necessarily have to be religion. It's all about your purpose, your whys, like why you get up in the morning. So that peak performance pyramid that these, performance psychologists talk about to create that ideal performance state, you get firefighters focusing on their physical, you get those emotional intelligence courses to really harness and understand their emotions and other people's emotions as well, and reading them correctly. Then you get the ability to just kind of unplug from the technology, get out into nature, go by the waterfront, whether it's a meditation like you were talking about, just really calming the mind. And then spiritual, understanding why you're doing what you're doing, and don't lose sight of it, because the spiritual piece is the pinnacle of that pyramid. And I think that's a very big piece that a lot of people, I'm not going to say forgot why they got into the job, but maybe needs to come back to the forefront. Because if you think about, why we became firefighters because we wanted to serve. And sometimes we need to be reminded of that.
And I think, what I really like about how you're depicting that is, like, it is a recognition that this is, these are verbs, right? It's not just about, a mission statement you make for yourself. It's about, you have to find ways to, even if it's small, right? Some way to kind of demonstrate to yourself or connect in some meaningful way. Why am I doing this, and what is this all about? If you lose that sense of kind of why or purpose, or lose sight of a contribution you're attempting to make, whether you make it or not, I think that's where people end up feeling really disillusioned and really alienated.
100%.
And the more, ask you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, just the more effective you are, again, as a person at home, the more effective you become as a person at work. So, this peak performance is not just at work. I mean, this translates into becoming a better person, someone who's, able to deal with the children a little bit better. Maybe you're not as short fused or whatever, because you're dealing with so many pressures, because you're able to get out and, harness your emotions, and then, get out for that walk to kind of clear your head and get into that mental space. I mean, it's a win-win. And that's why I think it would be really great if we could actually focus on our personal and our professional worlds using these athletic concepts.
What I was going to ask you is, people in your life, how do you want them to describe you?
just as someone who's not afraid to think outside the box. I'm the type of person that just when you talk to, well, my partner says when I talk to you, you're just that person who just thinks very differently. And it's just being able to capitalize on just the unorthodox ways of just applying different practices and different principles and different insights to the conventional world to try to make it into something a little bit better. That's kind of why I want people to look at me as.
Love it.
Love it. Totally.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, that's how I look at you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm always amazed that when we start these conversations, you're like, oh, it's an hour long. And next thing you know, I look down at the clock and went, how did the hour go by already? Yeah. I think, for me, the leadership conversation and human performance and human factors and everything you've talked about, Jamie, is so important for our listeners to understand because, I don't think that people show up to work to be an asshole. We don't hire bad people. It's a product of so many different small factors, large factors that really impact performance across the realm of whether you're on the floor, whether you're in a mid-management, captain, lieutenant position, battalion chief, and then on up, in paramedics, and it's the same thing. So I think, from our listener standpoint, just think about that from a leadership perspective is that, your leaders are trying to do the best that they can, given what they're doing. And maybe it is just a little bit more vulnerability about taking a look at things in a different way, to take that chance, take that step forward, to make a change that might be instrumental. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. How do we regroup? We just regroup and understand that we tried something and we are doing our best when we show up to work. I think that's an important thing for everybody to understand is not everybody's come to work being an a-hole, right?
When we talk about the fire service and there's stuff going on in the fire ground, we follow standard operating guidelines, and those are followed to a T because it's all about safety. But when we're talking about the non-emergency, this is when we can have a little bit of gray area. This is where we can start challenging and thinking a little bit differently, saying, is this the best way to do it, or do we need to revise this, or can we have these conversations? So firefighters, fire officers, chief officers, they really would benefit incredibly well if they created that psychological safe working environment where those individuals feel safe to have these conversations, to have this freedom of speech, if you will, where they're saying, can we try something different? Or I have a friend that actually, or a colleague that actually works in another department, and this is what they're trying. Be like, oh, okay, how can we try that? How can we work that into our traditions within our fire service? And if we don't become so stuck, if we don't become so stuck in our own traditions and our own organizations, I think really it's really truly endless on where we can go with it.
If there's any listeners out there that are interested in Jamie's recent publication and are interested about the Japanese airlines, I found it fascinating when I actually looked at that because it makes sense. Like Megan said earlier, these things are common sense, I think, when we teach, when we look at the people. So where can they go to it? Where can they find it? How do they access it? If there's anything that you can point people to if they're interested in doing a little bit of reading about it.
So the article is titled Humanity, Social Intelligence, and High Performance Teams, Character Lessons for the Public Sector. You can find it on LinkedIn. I think we can post it here through Boss, I guess.
Yeah, we can probably post a link in the show notes. So
okay.
I think, if there's anybody that's interested, take a look at the show notes as well. We'll post a link to the LinkedIn piece there.
Well,
Jamie. Just follow him on LinkedIn because he's prolific and he's constantly posting things. That's a smart thing to do.
But I'll tell you though, if anyone out there, any of the listeners want to really think or try something completely unconventional, really try and watch this. Why Japan Airlines almost went bust and how this Buddhist monk turned CEO just changed everything around. And he did it by focusing on people over profits. So if there's any dire straits that someone's in, any type of circumstances, watching this video will make you change completely, take a look at your situation completely different. It's just absolutely fantastic. It's riveting. It feels good. And for those that feel that, it's all about profits or it's all about shareholders. He's got lessons in there for that as well. So Japan Airlines went from nearly going bust to being one of the most profitable airlines. So if he can do that by focusing on people, then I think we in the public sector can borrow some of those lessons for our stakeholders or shareholders, excuse me, and we could really apply some of these principles and actually do incredibly well within our organizations.
Jamie, thank you for taking time out of your day to spend with us. But more than that, I mean, really, sincerely, I just love having people in my life who challenge me and who expose me to new ideas and who make me stop and think about things. And you are right up there. So I really appreciate that. And I thank you on behalf of the field as a whole, because I think you're challenging all of us to think about different ways that we can be and different ways we can take care of each other, which is, at the end of the day, I think what it's all about.
Thank you.
And Jamie, it's been a pleasure for the short time getting to know you. I look forward to, possibly meeting you in person at some point in time. And feel free to just keep sending the articles whenever they're written my way, because, even as we were sharing just before we went live, my wife, who is in a new leadership position, benefited from the simple concept for the Japan Airlines about putting people first. So I thank you. I'm grateful for that. And listeners, if you have any questions, shoot us a message through the show notes and look for Jamie's article through there. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you for being here, Jamie. And Megan, as always, we'll meet on the Ruck March and figure something else out.
Thank you both for having me. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Okay, we'll talk to you soon.
Bye now.
Okay.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Mental Health Mixtape, brought to you by the Before Operational Stress Program. We hope today's conversation has resonated with you and provided valuable insights into navigating the complexities of mental health. Remember, your well-being is our priority. If you or someone you know could benefit from the support and resources offered by the Before Operational Stress Program, don't hesitate to reach out. Take that first step towards a healthier, more resilient you. And here's a special treat for our dedicated listeners. A 15% discount waits for you when you sign up through the code provided in the show notes. Investing in your mental health has never been more accessible. We appreciate your continued support and commitment to breaking the stigma surrounding mental health. Let's keep the conversation going. And until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.